He said I'd forget. I remembered everything.
They opened the front door for me like I was the mail, politely, with the briefest lift of the chin, and then they let the door close between us, as if that thin slab of painted wood could separate what my hands had. Built from the contempt of a single night, I remember that first step back into my son's house as if it were a kitchen clock, striking the hour of some terrible change. I had driven from my small bungalow in East Texas at dawn, the mason jar of coins clinking in my bag like a guilty conscience, the old pearls tucked beneath my scarf because I would not let them be seen as Charity's last ornament. I came bearing the repayment of a debt I had promised to erase when his voice sounded full of shame on the phone. The kind of debt that eats at a man's pride and at a mother's sleep. About $2,500 for the hospital bills that should have been his brother's, and another $4,200 to quiet the creditors who thought they could frighten a family into submission. I had given everything I could spare without asking, to keep my son from sinking into a common pit. And yet, when I stood on his polished threshold, his wife, her eyes hard as cut crystal, asked if I had an appointment. They must have thought they were merciful to ask the question. Mercy, I have learned, is a costume worn by those who wish to convince themselves they did not commit a crime. I had not expected dinner on silver, nor the polite bows of strangers. I had expected a nod, an embrace, perhaps a cup of the tea I had always brought the first Sunday of each month. Instead, I found a table spread as though to hide the scars of a family. Portraits lined the corridor, each gilded face fixed in an expression of approval. My own face, once crinkled with lullabies and pies, hung far away on the mantel, half turned, as if to avoid acknowledging the hand that had fed and mended those very smiles. "How long will you be in town?" my son asked, all velvet and calculation, as if our past could be measured in hours and appointments. He offered me a chair that fit me as badly as a too-small glove. "We're very busy tonight," he said. "There's a gala, you understand. It was April 3rd, 2 days before the charity gala, that would place his name in the society column next to donors who never lifted a finger for anyone. I wanted to tell him that the mason jar of coins in my bag had been counted by my own shaking hands, that every coin came from the little savings I kept tucked behind the flour canister, kept for the day the roof faltered or the doctor frowned, that I had wired $6,000 on March 5th to settle an old lien, then another $6,500 on March 12th, and that there remained only a cushion small enough to look like pride, but not enough to hide my fingers. I wanted to tell him, but grandmothers are often swallowed by the very silence they teach their children to speak into existence. There were certain objects in that house that made me breathe differently. A chipped mug on the counter that matched the one I had given his wife when she first came to dinner, now tucked away as if its age embarrassed them. A shoebox of letters on a side table with my handwriting peeking from the edges like survivors. I noticed, too, a small locked box on the bookshelf with a brass key missing, the kind of locked box that held secrets and sometimes a last will. Old pearls rested in a velvet case under the glass of a coffee table, glinting like small moons and looking almost ashamed to be on display. They did not offer me the guest room. They offered me their patience measured in polite indifference. I slept that night in a chair by the window, my back against the cheap fabric of an armchair that had once belonged to my own mother. I listened as the house breathed around me, walls settling like old bones. And when the clock struck 3 in the morning, I thought of promises and of the durable power of attorney forms I had signed years ago. Documents I had made tidy in a folder with the date January 15th, 2015, written on the cover in my careful hand. Was the law a chain or a shield? I had once thought it both. My son had been a boy with mud on his knuckles and dreams the size of summer pies. I had stood in that same yard and washed the grass from his knees myself. He had vowed, in the soft, credible way children vow, to never let me want. We had a pact made of half-jokes and full breakfasts. He would be honest, I would be proud. But the world has a way of polishing a man's pride until it becomes a mirror that reflects only himself. I thought about the chipped mug and the mason jar, and about how countless times I had patched his shirts with needle and thread, the way one patches a heart to keep it from spilling. I thought about my pearls, which I had bought in 1978 with the savings from selling 12 jars of preserves at the county fair. The pearls were for dignity, not for display. The mason jar was my ledger and my altarpiece. Every sacrifice had been counted and kept. And yet here I was, in my son's house, feeling as if the coins in my pocket were heavier than the years of love they'd bought. "Mother, could you stay with us?" For a little while, his voice carried the odd mixture of desire and strategy that some men acquire when they plan their future, like a ledger. I nodded, because I was as weary as a shawl after a winter's day, because there is a long list of small kindnesses from which a mother rarely refuses to pick one. They smiled and said the words that families say, "Stay as long as you need," and then closed their doors on the subjects they had never intended to keep. I found myself empty-handed later that week, when I reached for a letter that had always been there, the letter my husband had written to me before he died, a stub of his voice folded in wax and crumbs. Someone had taken it. I looked in the old cedar chest, then in the locked box on the shelf. The key still missing, the lock still obstinate. I found the mason jar, the coins gone in neat stacks, a small paper note tucked where a coin would sit, with a single word, "Accounted." My hands shook so terribly that the chipped mug nearly slipped. I cupped the porcelain as if it were a newborn. I had not meant to snoop. The world, however, has a way of making us detectives of our own lives. Called my lawyer the next morning and asked him to bring copies of the durable power of attorney and the last will and testament I had executed on August 9th, 2018. I asked, in a voice that tried to pretend casualness, whether such documents could be amended without my knowledge. He hesitated, that lawyerly pause full of the polite stones lawyers throw when they are deciding whether to tell a truth that will bruise tender things. "Technically," he said at last, "a last will and testament can be challenged, but it depends on signatures, witnesses, and dates. A durable power of attorney can be revoked if the grantor is of sound mind and the revocation is properly recorded." He mentioned affidavits and notarizations in a language that tastes like paper and cold ink. The idea that a sheet of paper could stand between me and dignity amused me and frightened me. I thought of all the small laws of motherhood, the unspoken ones, and how they could not be notarized. And yet they often mattered more. That evening, as the sun fell like spilled honey over the pines, I overheard, mere feet from where I sat pretending to peel an orange, a conversation that would prickle the hairs on a saint. My son and his wife spoke in hushed voices by the French doors, their words intended for each other but sliding like wet stones into my ears. "We must make sure of the will before the gala," his wife said. "If the durable power of attorney is still in her name, we change it on April 12th at 3 p.m. She's forgetful. She'll never notice." My son nodded, the simple incline of a man's head that admits conspiracy when it thinks no one is watching. I clutched my orange and felt the peel stick to my fingers. The smell of citrus was suddenly a slap. April 12th, 9 days from that midnight. And yet they spoke as if I were already history. I had always been the keeper of birthdays and the one who stored Christmas decorations in the attic of my memory. And yet they planned to slip a pen through the web of my days and cut me out. I told myself I would not be surprised. I had been surprised enough, and surprise grows thin with repetition. But as they spoke of forged signatures and a lawyer comfortable with our situation, I felt an old ember of something heat my chest. Not hatred. Not yet, but the cold recognition that love mistaken. For duty had been traded for ledger lines and social proof. I left that night, with the mason jar, emptier than it had been and heavier than it should. And tucked the pearls back beneath my scarf. At 2 a.m, I sat at my kitchen table and counted pennies in patience and planned nothing but a small thing. I wrote a simple letter and dated it April 4th, 2024, addressed to my lawyer, asking him to come that very day at noon to review every legal paper in his care. I sealed it like a command, because sometimes the frailties of age are the last honest things a person has. They told me, in little cruel kindnesses, that I was being dramatic. They insisted that I had misheard. "You are my mother," my son said, as if that statement were a proof instead of an accusation. "We love you." He laughed once, without warmth, and asked me to sign a new form reassigning the keys to the safe deposit box. I held my pen as if it were an accused thing. I began to see the small betrayals as a gathering storm. A leak first, then a drip, then the sound a whole roof makes when it gives way. Small things started to vanish. A letter, a photograph, the key to the cedar chest. I found, in a drawer I had never thought to check, an envelope with the heading of a law firm I had never met, and a date. April 8th, 2024. It contained a draft of a suggested amendment to my last will and testament that would leave to my son the property I had purchased in 1999, valued at about $230,000, while providing me only with a life estate that required reasonable care as defined by their counsel. The words were soft, polite, and precise, a surgeon's scalpel in ink. I sat down and pressed my palms to my eyes. The mason jar, which I had filled over decades with pennies and lessons, felt suddenly absurd. How many times had a mother bled to cover a child's wound, only to find that the child preferred the color of the bandage to the fabric of the heart? They told me, when I confronted them with the draft, held it like a bird between shaking fingers, that it was merely a proposal for discussion. "We're protecting the assets," his wife said, and smiled a smile that had learned the convex cruelty of sufficiency. She used the words "we" and "protect" as if protection required erasure. I had saved that house from foreclosure. I had written checks with the same hand that now trembled. I had signed a durable power of attorney once, in a year when my memory was as sharp as a new knife. I had signed a last will and testament with witnesses at the county clerk's office on August 9th, 2018. How easy. They suggested with their smiles to change a paper without changing a heart. That night, I packed a small bag. I wrapped the pearls in tissue and placed the mason jar, now with just a few coins beside them. I took the chipped mug, because the chipped mug remembers where it's been and refuses to pretend otherwise. I sat on the edge of my bed with a letter I had written in younger handwriting, folded and kept since the days when promises were sturdy as oaks. Its edges were paper-soft with time. At 11:45 p.m., after I had locked my own door and listened to the house breathe like a patient, I heard a noise that was not the house, a car door, soft footsteps, then a pause at my gate. Someone had come for me. I stood very still, the paper letter burning against my palm, and I wondered whether that pause was mercy or menace. I never expected what I found in that drawer. They had come to my gate with the soft tread of a neighbor. But the silhouette in the moonlight was not a friend. It was the shape of a proof I had not yet earned. I opened the door a crack and saw Tom Jennings, the old teller from the bank where I had kept my modest account since 1987, coat buttoned, hat in hand, breath puffing in the cool night air. "Mrs. Walker," he breathed, as if that name still had the power to steady the world. "I thought you ought to know what they did at the safe deposit." He folded his hands together as if in prayer and handed me an envelope with the bank's stamp and a note. "For your eyes only. TJ." I carried that envelope like contraband, and I smelled the bank's night air for days afterward. A faint whiff of cash and toner, and the sort of civility that businesses wear when they do not want to reveal their hands. Inside the envelope were Xeroxed copies of signatures and a receipt dated April 9th, 2024, showing that a suggested amendment to my last will and testament had been filed at Hartwell and Pike. Attorneys at law, with witness names I recognized only by their neat, indifferent signatures. There was also a slip, a deposit slip, for the property tax payment on the house I had bought in 1999, paid in full on March 20th, 2024, in my handwriting. The paperwork smelled of betrayal and legalese. Every paper was a small blade designed to make me bleed in silence. I never expected what I heard next. I rang my lawyer's bell the next morning at 10. Evan Carlyle was a man who wore his creased suits like armor and spoke as if sentences were currency. He let me into his office where the blinds threw bars across his mahogany desk, and the clock insisted the truth could be measured. "Mrs. Walker," he said when he saw my face, "what brings you here?" I placed the envelope on his desk as if it were a small, heavy bird I could not carry alone. He read the copies, his forehead knitting like a curtain. "These are copies, not originals," he said slowly, tasting his words. "But they're enough to start. The names. These signatures are peculiar. He named the forms properly: durable power of attorney, last will and testament, suggested amendment to the will, affidavit of witness, and my heart conducted each term like church bells. Evan told me there were ways to challenge a will, contesting signature authenticity through a handwriting expert, subpoenas for original documents, motions for temporary injunctions to prevent any changes from taking effect. He mentioned dates: the April 12th meeting at 3 p.m. at the Hartwell and Pike offices, and I felt the air go out of my lungs as if someone had timed my breath. "You have to act before April 12th, he said, like a man giving a schedule for a siege. "If they file anything before then, you might be on the wrong side of a court order." He looked up, and his eyes were not unkind. "Do you have any witnesses who can attest to your state of mind when you signed your documents in 2018? Any original signed copies?" I thought of the folded letter from my husband, the key to the cedar chest, the pearls, the chipped mug, and the mason jar that had known every one of my sacrifices. My throat closed with a dryness that tastes of old grief. I went to the bank at once, because Tom Jennings had risked his pension to slip me that scrap of paper, and because the bank is the kind of place where records have a habit of telling the truth if you know how to ask them. The safe deposit box contained a revelation and a betrayal both. The original of my durable power of attorney, signed January 15th, 2015. The original last will and testament dated August 9th, 2018. And, a thing I had never imagined because the world is full of petty cruelties, a carbon copy of a different will, one that left the house to my son and limited my life estate to reasonable care to be determined by counsel. That carbon copy had been slipped between the pages like a counterfeit prayer. It was not notarized. The ink was different. The handwriting, while similar, bore the tiny idiosyncrasies a forgery often cannot hide. They had forged my signature because they believed I would be too old, or too trusting to notice. My hands shook as I held the original will and the fake side by side. The originals were my handwriting, the slant of the T's like the slope of the porch roof at my bakery, the way my late husband had taught me to press the nib of a pen. The fake had hesitations like a liar's excuses. Evan told me to breathe, to steady myself, and to prepare for war. "We'll need to hire a forensic document examiner," he said. "We'll subpoena the Hartwell and Pike files, and we'll file an emergency motion to prevent any transfers of assets. But you must allow us to move quickly. The law is fast-handed. I did not imagine lawyers as heroes. They are more often handymen with law degrees." But in that moment, Evan's calmness was like bandages. He wrote down April 12th, 3 p.m., and my teeth clenched. I wanted to be in two places at once, at the law firm to catch them red-handed, and at the gala where my son would smile beneath chandeliers bought on other people's charity. I wanted a speech as long as the guilt he wore. My allies were small and practical. Tom Jennings, who still kept a ledger of favors on a scrap of paper. Mrs. Alvarez next door, a retired magistrate with keen eyes who agreed to be a witness to my state of mind. And a young paralegal in Evan's office, Maya, who found that the suggested amendment had been prepared on an office computer at Hartwell and Pike with a user account named L. Barton, the same initials as a paralegal who left the firm last year under quiet circumstances. Mud clung to a shoe and then to a conscience. A trail is a trail, I learned in the small hours. How greed arranges itself, first a whisper. We need to protect the assets, then a plan. We'll ask a lawyer comfortable with our situation. And finally, the iron hand that believes it can write destiny with someone else's pen. They had believed they could fool me and the law. They had miscounted. The days that followed were a study in low, relentless work. Evan drafted motions and I signed affidavits in a voice that trembled but carried. Mrs. Alvarez came to my bungalow on April 7th and took down, in her slow, precise way, everything she could recall about the day I signed the original will in 2018, the journal on the kitchen table, the way I had boiled coffee that morning, the neighbor who had witnessed my signature. She wrote statements on stationery and sealed them, Tom Jennings collected deposit records and provided a bank affidavit dated April 9th to confirm the existence of the carbon copy he had found. Together, these small documents were stitches in a sore that would not close. I practiced the part of a woman who would not be surprised anymore, and yet every false smile from my son felt like a new incision. Midway through this slow, furious preparation, a small, Dumas-sized thought came to me, a moral that sits like a statue in the courtyard of the heart. Betrayal is like an inheritance, heavy and unavoidable. It burdens the betrayer before the betrayed. There is grandeur in the truth that outlasts the brief fortune of malice. On April 10th, I took a bold, perhaps foolhardy step. Knowing that the Hartwell and Pike office would meet on April 12th, I requested to see their file concerning my estate. The firm, predictably, refused to release it to a layperson. Yet a firm that refuses is a firm that sometimes forgets to lock its drawers. Maya, the paralegal, slipped me a copy of the computer metadata she had been able to access unofficially. User L. Barton had created the suggested amendment on April 8th at 4:22 p.m. The file was last accessed April 9th at 10:14 a.m. It was a pattern of time like footprints in mud. L. Barton had been friendly with my son's wife at a charity auction last winter, Maya whispered. And now the map of collusion widened. I did something I had never learned to do, but that life teaches swiftly. I confronted my son. I went to his kitchen the afternoon of April 10th, holding the photocopies like law and love in my hands. He was at the stove, stirring a sauce, his shoulders turned away like the back of a man who has secrets he can flavor. Why? I asked him very quietly. Why would you try to take away what I've kept with my own hands? He put down his wooden spoon like a doctor putting down a scalpel. Mother, he said, a word shaped to slice. You don't understand. We're doing what's best for the family. He smiled the kind of smile that has rotten teeth. You could become a burden. Mom. The phrase was a quiet bomb, I remembered with a sudden clarity. The night I had sewn the cuffs of his first school uniform by the light of an oil lamp because the electricity had gone out. I remembered drying his fevered brow and buying him chocolate when he aced his first math test. A burden? I echoed. Is love a burden then? His wife came into the doorway and looked at me as if she were inspecting a dress in a boutique and found it not quite in season. You signed forms, she said, as if a signature is a confession of weakness. Times change. She reached to touch the coffee mug on the counter, the chipped one I had given her years ago, and then drew her hand back as if its history embarrassed her. That night, I slept poorly, fretted between the mason jar and the pearls. I would not be a ghost in my own story. I rehearsed the words I would say at Hartwell and Pike on April 12th, or, if necessary, in court. Men and women who rob their elders are thieves with better table manners, I would tell them. I prepared a list of witnesses: Tom Jennings, Mrs. Alvarez, Evan Carlisle, Maya, and the clerk at the county office who remembered me signing papers on August 9th, 2018. Every memory becomes an affidavit if you know how to swear it correctly. April 12th came with a sky like linen. I dressed plainly, pearls hidden beneath my scarf. My legs walked me to Hartwell and Pike with an odd steadiness, as if my feet had been trained by grief. The lobby smelled of polished wood and varnish. The receptionist, who I had never seen smile at me before, looked as if she had practiced neutrality. My son arrived in a suit that fit him like a promise he had yet to keep. He wore arrogance the way some people wear cologne. We sat in a conference room beneath a painting of a pastoral scene, which looked as if someone had painted serenity to cover the frantic. The lawyer for Hartwell and Pike, a slim man named Douglas Hartwell, whose eyes were small and quick, arranged his papers. L. Barton did not appear. Instead, a more senior counsel, Ms. Rowland, stood and said the firm would not release original files without a court order. She spoke a kind of law that tastes of antiseptic. You may, of course, file a motion, she said. However, until April 12th at 3:00 p.m., the firm cannot be compelled to act. At 2:46 p.m., while pleasantries were exchanged, Evan suddenly stood and announced that he had received an email from a bank clerk, Tom Jennings, who had more information. Tom, face flushed from running, slipped an envelope across the table. Inside was the printout of a surveillance image from Hartwell and Pike's lobby, showing L. Barton leaving the office on April 9th at 10:20 a.m. with a small package. The image was grainy, but the profile was unmistakable. My son's face lost something then, like bread losing warmth. The room inhaled. I felt the clock tick like a metronome in a song I had not chosen. "You have until 3 p.m. to make this right," Ms. Rowland said. And for a heartbeat I wondered whether right meant legal or moral. It is a sad world in which law and rightness are not synonyms. At 2:59 p.m., my son moved. He reached for his phone and, with the practiced speed of those used to covering their tracks, called someone. I could not hear the voice at the other end, but his was urgent. "No, not now. We'll postpone." "Yes." He hung up and announced, with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes, "Perhaps we should reschedule." His attempt to control the scene was like a man rearranging chairs on a sinking ship. The room felt small and large all at once. I had expected one thing, a shudder of guilt, perhaps a denial, but not this clumsy retreat. I wanted to stand and declare what I knew, the forged signatures, the deposit slip, the metadata, the motives carved in ledger lines. Instead, I watched legal professionals trade phrases the way gamblers trade chips. Then, like a match struck in a dark room, Evan placed a sealed folder on the table and said, "I have one more thing." He broke the seal and produced a record, a voicemail, time-stamped April 9th, 2024, at 11:02 a.m., from a Hartwell and Pike office line to L. Barton's personal number. The voice on the message was clipped and clinical. "Confirm we have amended the will as discussed. Signatures will be provided later." There was a pause, then a softer voice saying, "Understood. We will proceed at 3 p.m. The room went silent, as if the walls themselves were listening. The voicemail was the sliver of proof that made collusion no longer conjecture, but crime. My son's jaw clenched. His wife's fingers tightened around her handbag. Ms. Rowland's mouth drew a line. She was a lawyer who had not expected to be summoned into an ethics trial on a Thursday afternoon. I rose then, not like a woman making a spectacle, but like a woman who has decided she will not be silent. I took the voice recording, the photocopies, the metadata, and the deposit slips, and with them I made a small, righteous pile on the conference room table. My voice did not tremble when I said, "This house is mine by every honest measure. You do not get to rewrite the lives of others with a pen you did not earn." The room held its breath. My son's face had become a map of bad weather. "Mother," he whispered, a word like regret and a plea. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I felt the burn of fury then, not in the trembling way of old loss, but as a flame that clears the air. My choice was made in a moment that was both terrible and beautiful. I would take back not only the property, but the story they had tried to erase. I would not allow them to write me into the margins. At the end of that meeting, Ms. Rowland suggested mediation to avoid public spectacle. My son suggested compassion. I suggested truth. They all suggested different kinds of victory. We left with no signed amendment and with a tentative agreement that Hartwell and Pike would not act until the court resolved the motion Evan promised to file at first light. The firm, anxious to avoid scandal, had a twitch of restraint. As I walked out into the sun, the pearls at my throat felt like armor. I felt something else, too, a small, dangerous elation. I had not known the shape of the word fight until it had to do with the sound of my name. But the war had only begun. That evening, as the city lights blinked like impatient eyes, I received a call that made my hands go cold. It was from a phone number I did not immediately recognize. The voice at the other end was low, careful. "Mrs. Walker," it said, "if you continue, you will lose more than property." The line went dead. I sat with the receiver warm against my ear and felt the old fear, not for myself as much as for the fragile things that made my life whole. My bungalow, my mason jar, the letters, the chipped mug. They were not yet finished. I had not expected this last threat. When the voice on the line told me I would lose more than property, I folded the receiver into my palm and felt the coolness of the plastic as if it were a talisman. The house across town with its marble steps and chandelier had been a queen's prize. Yet what they threatened to take beyond bricks and mortar was the very ledger of my life. The letters, the chipped mug that knew my thumbprint, the mason jar that counted my small mercies. I swung the bag with the pearls and the few coins into my lap and told myself what my mother used to tell me when storms came, that a roof may leak, but a heart mended with purpose will keep you warm. I did what one does when a storm promises to uproot the orchard. I marshaled friends, witnesses, and the stubborn machinery of the law. Evan filed an emergency motion for a preliminary injunction and a temporary restraining order on April 13, 2024, at 9 a.m., and the court docketed the matter for a hearing on April 20, 2024. At 9 a.m., Judge Marlene Hargreaves agreed to hear the motion immediately because the evidence suggested imminent transfers of assets and because Hartwell and Pike, eager to avoid scandal, was not comfortable in the light. The paperwork smelled of ink and petrol, and yet there was a clarity to it. A name, a date, a claim, restitution, restoration, and a demand for the original documents to be produced by April 15th. The law had become a slow, sure ladder I could climb. I remember standing in the corridor of the courthouse the morning the hearing was set, the sun slicing through the glass in an accusing strip. My pearls were hidden beneath my scarf, but I wore them inwardly like talismans. Mrs. Alvarez clasped my hand and said, "You are not alone." Tom Jennings, who had worn a bank teller's patience like a cape for 30 years, pressed his lips together and handed me another bank affidavit confirming irregular withdrawals linked to the suggested amendment. Maya and Evan brought folders thick with metadata, timestamps, user accounts, and the electronic breadcrumb trail from Hartwell and Pike's office computer that led straight to a user named L. Barton. The dates were small and precise, like teeth marks on a bone. April 8, 2024 at 4:22 p.m. April 9, 2024 at 10:14 a.m. Voicemail left at 11:02 a.m. on April 9th from the firm's main line. These were the tiny arithmetic truths that a court could not simply sweep aside. I will say plainly that the next few days were a blur of cold coffee and hot paper. I sat with Dr. Helena Ruiz, a forensic document examiner Evan had engaged, in a small room smelling of toner. She took the original last will and testament, dated August 9, 2018, and the carbon copy with the suggested amendment, and studied them like a jeweler examines a stone. On April 15, 2024, at 2:30 p.m., she called me and her voice sounded like a bell. "Mrs. Walker, there are 5 specific points in the question document that are not consistent with your known signatures. Pressure patterns, stroke order, and ink flow suggest forgery." Her written report, filed with the court that same day, was a ledger line I could not argue with. They could no longer tell themselves they were merely protecting the assets. A forgery is not an act of prudence. It is the theft of consent. At this mid-turn in my tale, I must admit to an elder's truth: justice is less often dramatic than it is persistent. There is an austere beauty in the law's slow machinery. It can grind, but it also reveals. Greed imagines itself quick. Truth remembers the calendar. I remember the courtroom that morning, April 20th, 2024, like an altar. People dressed in their Sunday civility showed up to watch the spectacle of family and commerce clash. The judge's bench was a wooden throne of impartiality. My son sat to one side, his brow furrowed like a man trying to remember a prayer he had once known. His wife sat beside him, her posture straight as if carved from plaster. Hartwell and Pike sent Ms. Rowland again, and my heart gave a little twist when I saw she no longer carried the same calm. Evan presented the emergency motion with a clarity that made the facts snap into place. He read aloud the voicemail, the metadata, the deposit slips, and Dr. Ruiz's findings. He called witnesses. Tom Jennings testified to the discovery of the carbon copy in the safe deposit box on April 9th. Mrs. Alvarez testified to witnessing my general health and lucidity on the date of original signing in 2018. Maya corroborated the internal access logs showing L. Barton as the user who drafted the suggestion. Each testimony was a stitch closing a wound. When the prosecution of fact met the defense of convenience, the hush in the room tightened. Ms. Rowland, representing Hartwell and Pike, offered a position that sounded, in its smooth words, like a soft bed for hard deeds. We acted in good faith on client instruction. She then asked the court for a continuance to consult internal records. Judge Hargreaves, who had the look of someone who'd seen more human theater than most, did not oblige her with softness. Instead, she ordered Hartwell and Pike to produce their internal files and to preserve all electronic logs. She granted the temporary restraining order, effective immediately, enjoining any transfers or amendments to Mrs. Walker's estate until a full hearing could be held. The judge's voice was that of a woman who prefers facts to fables. At that moment, I felt the room change temperature. The small, confident world my son had tried to build, one built on polished appearances and whispered assurances, began to show the hairline cracks of disgrace. I did not expect the next turn, the personal unraveling that follows a public order. Within 24 hours of the TRO, Hartwell and Pike released an internal statement acknowledging irregularities in their handling of privileged documents and placed L. Barton on administrative leave pending investigation. The firm, which had once been a polished face for respectable clients, now ducked behind legalese and PR. Yet the tide of consequence does not stop at firmer phrases. It spreads. It was Miss Rowland who told me, in a corridor that smelled of vending machines, that L. Barton had been an employee until last November and had left the firm under circumstances described then as mutually agreeable. She said it like a woman repeating a weather report. A call from the county prosecutor, whom Evan had contacted, suggested they were opening a criminal inquiry for suspected forgery and fraud. I had never wanted another's ruin, yet I wanted my truth. You might ask, as many ask me now, did I want them punished? The answer sits like coal in the mouth. I wanted justice, which is not revenge flavored to the eye, but restoration dressed in statute. I wanted my name and my life returned. I wanted the mason jar to remain mine, not a ledger someone else could steal. The days that followed were a slow exposure of small complicities. Under the court's subpoena, Hartwell and Pike turned over logs showing repeated access to client files from internal accounts, and the forensic examiner matched the computer workstation used to draft the suggested amendment with evidence of a USB drive keyed to L. Barton's credentials. A search of L. Barton's last known email account revealed communications with my son's wife, arranging assistance and speaking of a comfortable arrangement, conscience, has a way of being remembered by computers. The threads, when tugged, pulled others along. None of this was easy or beautiful. My son, confronted with the evidence, first tried to deny, then to minimize, then finally to admit in a small, broken voice that he had been frightened of debt and of losing status. He admitted to suggesting options to L. Barton and to speaking with Hartwell and Pike's paralegal, but he insisted he had not intended any forgery, only draft guidance. It is remarkable how men who would have you believe their intentions pure will offer the word guidance when the world demands a signature. His wife, under the pressure of documents and of conscience, eventually signed a statement admitting to contacting L. Barton and asking for assistance in drafting language to limit my life estate in the event of incapacity. At the secondary hearing on May 2nd, 2024, Dr. Ruiz's written report was accepted as evidence. The county prosecutor filed charges against L. Barton for felony forgery and submitted the matter to a grand jury. Hartwell and Pike faced professional scrutiny, and Ms. Rowland, in the peculiar economy of professional reputations, expressed regret and pledged cooperation. My son was ordered by Judge Hargreaves to attend mediation and to provide a sworn accounting of any transfers linked to the suggested amendment. She also ordered that all amended documents be declared null and void, pending full adjudication. The temporary restraining order became a cage for deceit. Then came the small, public humiliation that tastes like a lemon, but cleanses my son's name, which once appeared in society pages for charitable gifts, was withdrawn from the gala program. Invitations that had once landed like confetti now avoided his mailbox. He resigned from the charity board on May 10th in what his publicist called a desire to focus on family matters. People who had once admired his framed certificates now averted their eyes. There is a cruelty in social shame, but there is also justice in a life unmasked. But the law does not only punish, it repairs when it can. At a settlement hearing on June the 2nd, under the pressure of looming criminal charges and the weight of evidence, my son agreed to a civil settlement. He would restore the property title and pay $35,000 in restitution and legal fees, a figure representing a partial reimbursement and my counsel costs, and provide a public, court-ordered apology for his actions. His wife pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of solicitation and agreed to community service and an order to attend family counseling. L. Barton, facing stronger criminal exposure, entered a plea agreement in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors. In court, she admitted forging the suggested amendment and implicated my son and his wife in the attempt to procure it. The grand jury returned an indictment for forgery in July, and L. Barton was sentenced, after a plea bargain, to probation, restitution to the law firm for falsified bills, and mandatory counseling. Hartwell and Pike faced disciplinary review by the state bar and were fined for insufficient supervision. Poetic justice, when it comes, is often less a bright thunderclap than a steady unmasking. My son stood in that courtroom with a face that had lost its shine and said the words the judge demanded. "I apologize." They were thin at first, and then they thickened with the weight of truth. He returned the keys to the safe deposit box, and with them came my husband's letter, which he had hidden in a jacket pocket. It was as if he had rummaged in his own conscience and found a buried relic. I felt the letter tremble in my hands when he gave it to me. My fingers remembered it by texture, the slight fold near the bottom where my husband had once pressed a life's resignation into paper. I read it there in the courthouse hallway with my allies around me like a small flock, his handwriting as steady as the first seasons we had weathered together. He had written in that small, impulsive script of faith in our children and a plea to keep our home safe. The letter was the last hinge in the door of my own past. It swung open and let me step back in. They had taken some things, attempted to take more, but they had not broken what a mother builds in little acts: nightly soups, morning kisses, the careful saving of pennies in a mason jar for a rainy day. The court restored the original last will and testament and issued an order that the property be returned to me with title cleared. The amount of about $230,000 that the house represented was no small thing, but neither was it my only measure of worth. It was enough, however, to ensure my independence for the rest of my days. Justice had not come without cost. I had seen the brittle look of broken family at close quarters and felt the ache of betrayal that is harder to stitch than clothing. But in the quiet aftermath, when the courthouse lights dimmed and the papers were filed, there came a surprising relief, a feeling of rights returned and wrongs acknowledged. There is a form of reconciliation that justice sometimes demands, not an embrace, but an accounting. My son fulfilled his court-ordered obligations. He paid restitution, surrendered certain privileges, and agreed to participate in counseling. He did not, in any meaningful way, regain his place beside me in the small rituals of daily life. He had to rebuild that trust like a man laying new bricks. I forgave him quietly, in a manner that was mine, but I did not forget. Forgiveness, I have always believed, is not permission. It is the slow loosening of a tight knot until the rope is no longer needed to hold you up. The locked cedar chest, which had been rifled and hidden in a closet, was returned to me. Inside it were the letters, my husband's docket, my old promises, and a small photograph from 1972 of a picnic by the Brazos River. I placed the pearls around my neck the first Sunday after the court's decision and felt their weight not as a burden but as jewelry reclaimed, dignity regained, threaded with memory. I chose not to live in that big house on the marble steps. Some people would have, many did. But I wanted instead to protect the life I had known, my bunk of a bungalow with the porch that creaked like an old friend. So I kept the property in my name and leased it to a small family that promised to keep the roses I had planted. The lease brought steady rent and the satisfaction of knowing that my home would shelter others. I refilled the mason jar, not with all my savings, but with small coins and a few bills, as a symbol more than a fund. I kept the chipped mug on my kitchen counter, right where it always had been. When friends asked why I did not punish them further, I answered as any grandmother would, because my life had to go on. There is a particular dignity in choosing one's future over nursing one's wounds. I had won restitution of about $35,000 plus legal fees paid, the return of the house title in full, and the restoration of my most private papers. More important, I had my independence and the knowledge that I had fought for it. Before the final confrontation, I whispered to myself something that Alexandre Dumas might have inked in a margin. Fortune will smile on those who keep their courage, and misfortune will be brief for those who answer deceit with steady law. Let truth be your sword, but patience your shield. Now, months later, I sit at my kitchen table with the chipped mug warming my hands and the mason jar glinting on the shelf. The winter light slants across the table and catches the pearls at my throat. My hands have slowed, but they are steady. People sometimes ask what it felt like to stand against my son and win. I think of a garden in spring. You do not see the roots while the wind is tearing at the stems, but you feel the ground hold. That is what it felt like. An invisible support of good witnesses, of honest records, of the stubborn law that keeps a society from dissolving into private violence. What I want you to remember, if my tale touches you at all, is that small things matter. A mason jar saved through lean winters, a chipped mug that remembers the kitchen's heat, a letter kept in a cedar chest. When someone tries to rewrite your life with forged ink and whispered deals, do not accept silence as an answer. Gather your papers, find your witnesses, and call the law if you must. Pride and dignity are not merely sentimental things to be shelved. They are armor you earn by the way you live. My son sits in his own life now with less applause and more time for thought. There has been sorrow and an apology, and time will tell whether he has learned to measure love in acts rather than accounts. He and his wife have to live with the consequences of their choices. I, for my part, have learned that being a mother does not mean being a doormat, and that sometimes the bravest act is to tell the truth in a courtroom. If my story has given you any small courage, if you have felt the prick of recognition, the sting of someone you loved betraying you, then do something simple and brave. Make a list. Find a witness, and do not be ashamed to seek help. There is power in papers, yes, but there is greater power in people who will stand with you and speak the truth. If this old heart story moved you, please share it with someone who needs courage today. Leave a comment with your own small victories, and if you'd like to hear more confessions from this life, these small battles, these small triumphs, subscribe and press the bell to be with me when the next story comes. There are many more truths in these bones, and I am not finished telling them. If nothing else, remember the mason jar, the pearls, and the chipped mug. Keep them safe, for they carry more than things. They carry the measure of who you are.